Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. So in this video we're going to cover how to understand jazz chords, and I want to explain some of the common mistakes that I see with my students, and I want to give you an actual method of working them out. In this video I'm not going to be showing you lots of voicings or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about understanding them. We're talking about the theory here. However, by understanding the theory and knowing the note names on your guitar, you should get to the point where you're actually able to work out your own chord voicings, and you don't need to rely on a chord voicing dictionary or other people to show you nice voicings. You can actually come up with them yourself. So the two skills you need to know to be able to do that are you need to know your note names on the instrument, which we talked about in a recent video, which you can see up here. And you also need to understand what a chord symbol is trying to tell you. By being able to interpret the chord symbol and knowing where those notes live on your guitar, you can try out lots of different versions until you find a voicing that you like. And that's really your end goal as a guitarist, is to be able to find your own voicings without needing to rely on that input from others. So when we first look at jazz chords, they can look very complicated and confusing, and when people try and figure them out on the instrument, they often come up with some pretty strange interpretations. So the first thing we need to know about jazz chords is that there are three rules that we need to always bear in mind no matter what we're doing. The first rule is that the chord on the page will only use as much ink as is necessary. There should be no extra information. These chord symbols are supposed to be sight readable, so the less information that's put in there, the better. Because of this, you'll rarely see a chord symbol that's got that much information in it. What we need to do when we're learning to read these, at first, is to learn to break them down into their chunks of information, learn to understand those, which is what we're doing in today's video, and then put them back together. And in no time, because they're so small, these chord symbols, you'll be able to do it all in one go. The second thing we need to be aware of at all times with a chord symbol is that everything within that chord symbol is assumed to be drawn from the major scale. If we think back to rule 1, we only want as much information in the chord symbol as necessary. So a great way to reduce the information is to expect the reader to assume something about it. So the first assumption we make as a chord reader is that all of the information we're seeing in that chord symbol is referring to the major scale. So if you see numbers, if you see letters, anything, it tells us that it's the version you would find in the major scale of that chord's root. And the third thing you need to be aware of when reading chord symbols is the exception to rule 2. There's only one exception in the whole of music. Everything is assumed to be drawn from the major scale apart from the 7th, which is assumed to be flattened. Now we're going to keep referring back to those assumptions throughout the rest of this video. So just to recap, assumption 1 is that if it's included in the chord symbol, it's because it's important. We only use as much ink as is necessary to write a chord. Rule 2, everything in that chord is assumed to be drawn from the major scale built on that chord's root. We'll talk about what a root is in a moment. And rule 3 is there's one exception to rule number 2, and that is the number 7. If you see a 7, it is assumed to be flattened. So the first bit of information you see in any chord symbol is the root. Now, like I said at the beginning, we need to learn to break our chords down into chunks. So all we're interested in for this part of the video is the very, very first thing that's drawn in our chord symbol. Now there's two common mistakes that people make when looking at the root. The first mistake is to think it just means a single note. So if we have a chord and it's C major 7, we're just looking at the first bit of information there, which is C. C doesn't mean play the note C. C is actually wanting to give us more information than that. Remember, we're trying to give as much information in the least amount of ink possible. So C doesn't mean the note C, it means the chord C, or the triad of C. Now at this point, because we're ignoring the rest of the chord, if you just saw C written on a page and that was the end of the chord, you would of course play a C major chord. Now presumably if you're watching this video, you're someone who can already play some chords on the guitar and you're now interested in moving into jazz chords, which of course have a bit more colour to them. There's usually a few extra notes in there. So you're used to seeing C written in a pop song and playing a C major chord. So we continue that same assumption in jazz chords. If you just saw C, which you rarely do, but if you did, because for the purposes of this video we're ignoring the rest of the chord, we can currently only see C. So we're playing a C major chord. Now the second mistake people make, simply looking at the root, is to ignore sharps or flats. The root can be sharp or flat. That is very different to major or minor, which people often confuse it with. Sharp or flat is simply the name of a note. So the root can be C, but the root can also be C sharp or B flat or A. So the first bit of information in the chord is a note name, and we know that note names can be sharps or flats. So if you saw B flat 7 sharp 5, the root of that chord is not B, it's not B, flat 7, sharp 5, it's B flat. If you see a sharp or flat directly after the root of the chord, it is telling you about the root. So we would, in that instance, assume we're talking about a B flat major chord, and not a B chord with something flat later on. No, B flat. So already, just by looking at the root, we have 3 notes. It's one bit of information, a note name, which could include the sharp or flat, but it's actually telling us not to just play one note, it's telling us to play 3. It wants the major chord or the major triad. So C means C major, B means B major, E flat means E flat major. And every chord will start with the assumption of a major triad. Now the next bit of information we get in a chord tells us about the tonality. Now the tonality is whether the chord is major or minor. Now at this point of the chord, you only need to tell us if it isn't major. We've already assumed it is major. If the root was C, we've assumed it was C major. So we never write major. You will never see major written in a chord symbol, telling us about the tonality. Now, if you do see major, you know it must be to do with something else, which we'll come to in a moment. But at this point of the chord, you will see normally 3 symbols. One is a minor symbol. Now, there's a few different ways of indicating minor. One of them is a little M. So if you see a little M there, that means that C chord is actually a C minor chord. Another way to indicate minor is a little hyphen. That means minor as well. So we take that root chord that we've assumed is major and we go, well now the chord's telling me to make it minor. Now to make something minor, all we do is flatten the 3rd note, flatten the 3rd degree of the scale. So let's go back to our example of C. Let's say we were playing C in this position. We would figure out which one of those notes is the 3rd, C, D, E, well there's E there, and I would flatten it. And I now have a C minor chord. So they don't tell us if it's major. We have to assume it's major. That was one of our assumptions. But they will tell us if it's not major. They'll correct that assumption by using some sort of minor indicator, normally a little M or a hyphen. Now there's 2 other symbols that are commonly used at this point. One of them is a plus sign, and that means augmented. The other is a circle, and that means diminished. We will talk about augmented now, but we'll get to diminished in the next step. So augmented is just a posh way of saying sharpen the 5. Now augmented, like I say, is normally a plus sign, but it's sometimes written as AUG, like aug. And there's another way to write it, which we'll come to again later in the chord symbols. So augmented means take that major chord and raise the 5th. So that would look like this. Again, if we use our C shape here. Well, what's the 5th of C major? C, D, E, F, G. G sharp. So in that instance, that would be written C plus or C aug. And that means C, E, G sharp or 1, 3, sharp 5. So the next bit of information that you'll find in a chord symbol is some sort of reference to the 7. So by the time you've got to the number 7 in a chord, if we've been splitting it into chunks and analysing each chunk separately, you've at most seen 2 other bits of information. You've seen the root, which is a letter name that we assume to be a full major chord. So it could just be C, and that means a C major chord, please. It could be E flat, and that means an E flat major chord, please. It could be G sharp, and that means a G sharp major chord, please. The second bit of information which we may have seen is something to do with the tonality of the chord, and there's a few symbols that we would see at that point. The most common is a minor, which is a little M or a dash, and that means, you know, I just asked for a major chord. Yeah, can you actually flatten the third of that, please? The plus sign or augmented means, you know, I've just asked for a major chord in the root symbol. Yeah, do you mind actually at this point raising the fifth of that, please? And the other symbol you may see is a little circle or the word dim, which is actually a type of 7, so we're going to talk about that in this section of the video. But first, let's talk about just 7 by itself. So let's say we saw the chord C7. There's 2 bits of information there, C and 7. So if we were to analyse each separately, C, we assume that means, can I have a C major chord, please? So we would be playing a C major chord. The only other bit of information in that chord is 7. Now remember our 3 assumptions. Least ink possible, everything is assumed major, the exception is a 7. So this chord is asking me for a C major, and then it wants a 7. Now that means not the one from the major scale, but the flattened one from the major scale. So if I play my C major scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So my 7th note is B. I don't want B. That's a nice sound that we'll come to in a moment. But because it just asked for 7, I have to assume they meant a flattened 7. So I'm going to take that B and I'm going to play instead a B flat. So I'm playing there a C major chord indicated by the letter C and a B flat indicated by 7, which implies flat 7. We have to assume that. Let's take another chord type. Let's say it was now a C minor 7. Well, the C means, can I have a C major chord, please? So I'm going to use this C major voicing again for this one. Tick, done. We now understand the C bit of the chord. The next bit of information was the tonality, a little M or a dash. I prefer the dash, so I'm going to use a dash here. And that means, you know how I've just asked you for a C major chord? Do you mind flattening the third of it now, please? So that's my E to an E flat. 3 becomes a flat 3. So I've done the root and I've done the tonality. There's now only one bit of information left in this chord and it's a 7. And that again means a flattened 7. We have to assume it means flattened 7 because they haven't given us anything to assume otherwise. So the flat 7 we just worked out is B flat. Although this is a minor chord, we're still using the notes of the major scale. So C major scale, flattening that B down to a B flat. Gives me a lovely C minor 7 chord. So what if I wanted a B natural? Well, let's look at an example of that. This chord here says C major 7. Now, the major throws a lot of people. This chord is not C major 7, it is C major 7. Now that's really important because remember our assumptions. The C is already assumed to be major. We don't need to say it again. That's using more ink than we need. So if we see major or maj or any other symbol, sometimes a triangle, if we see that written in the chord, we know it must be correcting something that is assumed to not be major. Well, there's only one thing that is assumed not major, and that is the 7. So C major 7. So C means, can I have a C major chord, please? And then the next bit of information, major 7 means the 7 that lives in the C major scale. Well, again, we've already worked this one out, and we know the 7th note of the C major scale is B natural. So if you see maj written in a chord, something to do with major, you know it's to do with 7. The only reason we would say anything to do with major is if we were talking about 7. What a lot of people do is read this chord as C major, 7. No. So if you see anything to do with major, it has to relate to the 7th degree. I hope I've hammered that point home, because that is a big mistake that a lot of us make. So the final type of chord is a diminished 7. So this is the little circle that I've mentioned a couple of times, or the word dim. Now this is again connected to the 7. It's not really a type of tonality. So diminished 7 tells us to do 3 moves. Let's use A diminished 7 for our example. So again, let's break it down into chunks. If we just saw A written on the page, we would play an A major chord. So let's play an A major chord here. Now, just like in major 7 chords, diminished 7 chords are to be read as one bit of information. They tell us 3 movements. They tell us, please flatten the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7. So we've got our A voicing here. It wants me to flatten the 3rd first of all, so my C sharp is becoming a C natural. It's lowered. It also wants me to flatten the 5th. Well, that's currently an E, so it's going to become an E flat. So I've already got what we'd call a diminished triad. But this chord's got a 7 in it as well. So 7 we would assume would be a G, because in A major, my 7th note is G sharp. So I would lower that to a G, because we assume we want a flattened 7th. So G sharp, if we flatten it, if we lower it by 1 note, gives us G natural. So far we've got A, C, E flat, G. But here's the important thing. That diminished 7 tells us to flatten the 3rd, flatten the 5th, and flatten the 7 beyond its assumption. So it's already assumed to be flat, so we're going to almost double flatten it. So that gives me A, C, E flat, and G flat. Because the major 7, G sharp, is assumed to be flattened, which gives us G. And this chord type, a diminished 7, wants us to flatten that again. It wants us to flatten the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7. So that gives us a G flat. So just to summarise our diminished 7 chord, it wants us to flatten the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th beyond their assumptions. So we assume that the 3rd and the 5th are drawn from the major scale. That means in the key of C, they would be E and G, and they would be flattened to E flat and G flat. And we have to flatten the 7th degree beyond its assumption as well. Well, the assumption for the 7th is that it's already flat. So again, in the key of C, a flattened 7 would be B flat, and it would flatten again to a B double flat, we would technically call that, which looks like an A. So in the key of C, we would have the root, the flat 3rd, E flat, the flat 5th, G flat, and the double flattened 7, because it's already assumed flat, and we've flattened it again, which gives us the note A. And we can call that B double flat. So the final part of a chord are extensions and alterations. These are just lists of numbers that we can shove at the end of the chord that give very specific information about what we might want to do to the chord. And there's only one thing that can catch us out here. Now there's only 7 numbers that we're allowed to use at the end of the chord. The first, and probably the most common, is the number 5. So we can have C7 sharp 5. So if we take that chord, for example, C7 sharp 5, the first bit of information says, can I have a C chord, please? And we assume they mean a C major chord. 7, we assume they mean the flattened 7, which we've already worked out is a B flat. And then they say, oh, do you mind actually playing a sharp 5 instead? So I've got to work out where to get a sharp 5 from. So because I've played these chords millions of times, I now know where these notes live. But like I say, for you, if you're still new to these, you need to know your note names better on the guitar, and you can start to build these for yourself. So C7 sharp 5 could be this, which is exactly the same as a C augmented 7. C plus 7. It just means raise the 5th, please. And again, we talked about that being a G sharp. So this chord here, C, E, G sharp, B flat. E, G sharp, B flat. Similarly, we can be asked to flatten the 5th. So we could be asked for probably the most common example, which is a minor 7 flat 5. So let's use A again. So if we had just A minor 7 flat 5, if we just saw A, we would assume A major. The next bit of information in this chord is A minor. So they're saying, I know we've just asked for an A major chord, but can you minor it, which means flatten the 3rd. So we're now A, C, E. A minor 7. They haven't told us anything about that 7, so we assume it's flattened, which means it's a G natural in this case. And then they say, oh, do you mind actually flattening the 5th? A, C, E. So I need to now play an E flat, which gives us A minor 7 flat 5 if we take it step by step. So the 5th can either be raised or lowered, sharpened or flattened. Then there's only 6 numbers left. 2, 4, 6, and 9, 11, 13. Now these are actually the same numbers. If you play through a C major scale, note 2 is D and note 9 is D. Remember that the octave gets us back to the same note. So note 1 and note 8 are both C. Therefore note 2 and note 9 are both D. The only difference between the higher extensions and the lower extensions being 2, 4, 6, and the higher extensions being 9, 11, 13, is that 9, 11 and 13 also include the number 7 in them. Now remember, we want to use as little ink as possible. So if we want a 2 and a 7 in a chord, it's easier just to add them together and say 9. If we want a 4 and a 7 in a chord, it's easier to add them together and just say 11. If we want a 6 and a 7 in a chord, it's easier just to add them together and write 13, rather than 7 and 2, which is more ink, 7 and 4, which is more ink, and 7 and 6, which is more ink. So there's only 3 notes you can add, 2, 4 and 6, but if you see them written as 9, 11 or 13, it's including the 7 in it, which is why the maths is 7 plus 2, 9, 7 plus 4, 11, and 7 plus 6, 13. So you may see a chord such as C9. Let's break that down. C. What would you play if a chord said C? Well, of course, by now we've got the hang of this. If a chord just said C, we would play a C major chord. The number 9, well, what does that mean? Well, all you need to do is take 7 away from it. So 9 minus 7 is 2. So it wants us to add the note 2 and the note 7. Well, we assume still that the 7th note is flattened. We assume the 7th note is flattened, always. So we're adding a B flat to this chord. But this chord didn't just ask for C7, it asked for C9. So it wants the 7 and the 2. C, D, 1, 2. So we're going to be playing C, E, B flat, D. And I can add a G on top as well if I want. And I say if I want because you don't need to play every note just because those are the notes of the chord. You can just play the ones you want. So very often for a C9 we'll just play C, E, B flat, D. Now an alteration is one of those higher extensions has been raised or lowered. Now in this instance we do still use the 7 terminology. So for example, if we wanted a raised 9th, a sharpened 9th, we would say C7 sharp 9 or C7 flat 9. Whereas if we just want the natural 9, we can just say C9. So when you see an alteration, you will see the number 7 as well. So if you see a 7, you know that any of the higher numbers, they need to be different, they need to be changed. So for example, you might have B flat 7, flat 13. Let's look at that chord. Well, if we just saw B flat, we would play a B flat major chord. The next bit of information in this chord is B flat 7. So we assume that means the flattened 7. So a flattened 7 in the scale of B flat. Well, what's the natural 7, the major 7? Oh, that's an A natural. So I'm going to be playing an A flat instead because 7 means the flattened 7th. So I'm now playing a B flat major chord with an additional flattened 7th. And then the chord asks me for a flat 13. Well, 13 minus 7, what's that? That's 6. So I want note 6 flattened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, note 6 of my B flat major scale is G. So I want G flat. So I need to add that in to what I'm already playing. So I was playing a B flat major chord with a flat 7. And I now want a flat 13, which is a G flat. Well, easiest way for me to get that is up here on the B string, which gives me that augmented sound, and I can still add a low F if I want the F as well. So I've tried to cover all the common mistakes that my students make when naming chords. It is an undeniably difficult topic. The better you know your major scale, the easier chords are. If students come to me for lessons, I will not discuss chords with them until they've demonstrated that they're very confident not only playing their major scale on the instrument, but correctly labeling the notes of the major scale as well. So that includes using the correct enharmonic equivalents, so not calling a D sharp and E flat. Even though they are the same note, you need to know in a B major scale, for example, that the D sharp is the third and it's not an E flat. So once students know that really, really well, we can start to move on to labeling chords and building them on the instrument. It is confusing at first, but make sure you break down each chord into its individual chunks. Normally, the root, which requests a major chord, the tonality, which tells us if it doesn't want that chord to actually be major, and that can be minor, augmented. Then we've got our sevens, where 7 itself means a flattened 7. If we want the 7 from the major scale, it has to be requested using some indicator of major, so major 7 or maj 7, sometimes a triangle 7, or a diminished 7. Now, a diminished 7 means can I have a flat third, a flat fifth, and an additionally flattened 7th on top of the assumed flattened 7. So it gives us a double flattened 7. Next we have extensions. Now extensions are numbers added after the chord. 2, 4 and 6 become 9, 11, 13 to indicate that we would also like the 7th present. So to figure out which one they are of those big numbers, you simply take 7 away from it. With chord extensions, you won't see the number 7 written. It'll just be the root, the tonality, and a big number. But the 7 is still assumed flattened, unless the chord requests something to do with major. And finally, alterations. With alterations, there's only 4 possibilities: flat 9, sharp 9, sharp 11, and flat 13. If you see those, they will be preceded by the number 7, to let you know that the 7 still functions as normal, but the alteration is changing the assumed extension. So I hope you feel you can maybe start to tackle some slightly more complicated chords now, break them down section by section as we've just summarised, and ensure that you really understand those 3 assumptions: the least amount of ink possible, everything assumed to be drawn from the major scale of the root, the exception being the number 7, which is assumed to be flattened from the major scale option. If you made it this far and you found this video useful, please do give this video a like, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share with any of your friends who might also benefit from this information. Leave me a comment down below with some of the most confusing chords that you've encountered, and I'll definitely break those down in a future video for you, hopefully help you out. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well, getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers!
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never never forget. Ay. Drip, drip, but drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out. And I heard you find it difficult to cope.